Well, my name is Greg Lindsay. I am a journalist, futurist, speaker, of course. I hold several postings at MIT's Future Urban Collectives Lab, where we work on the future of cities. I'm also a non-resident senior fellow at the Arizona State University Threatcasting Lab, where we use a foresight methodology called threatcasting to help entities like NATO and the US Secret Service think about threats. And I also am a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, where I help them work on global trends. So thinking a lot about the future of cities, climate, and just about everything. Well, when it comes to the future of work, I am not quite worried that the robots will take our jobs, but I am very curious about how these advances in generative artificial intelligence are playing out. I've been spending a lot of time, for example, thinking about agents, which is the idea of that after chatbots come AI programs that can increasingly act for themselves. And I've spoken to a lot of organizations and experts in this and technologists who are actively trying to create digital twins of people and of organizations that would allow them to replace the tasks and functions of people. And so I'm not quite worried, as I said, but I am very concerned about how will this play out? How will we use AI and these technologies to augment human productivity and help people be better versions of themselves versus automating and replacing them? And that's going to be a question not just of the technology, but of policy, but of how organizations use it, of the political economy involved. And again, that's work that I'm doing with various think tanks, playing out these scenarios about like how do we ensure that AI is used equitably and not just simply concentrated in the hands of a very few. And I think this is a key concern for any organization, given that we see the dominance of technology firms already, and we see AI concentrated in just a handful of firms like OpenAI and Microsoft and others. How do we ensure that more power is not concentrated in their hands? And again, how do we help people own their digital twins or be in control of their likenesses or be able to express themselves in this? So I think there's a lot of questions out there, and we haven't really begun to grapple with the consequences. That's an amazing question to think about. We look back over the last 20 to 30 years, and now we're in the 90s to early 2000s and think about how that changed. I mean, obviously, it'll be a question of, what are the next technological advances? And how does that play into organizations and how does that play into the climate crisis? So, for example, I mean, obviously, I hope cities will evolve where they will use a combination of technologies and techniques and nature to make themselves more adaptable and resilient to the climate crisis. Things as simple as planting more trees for shading and defeating urban heat island effects, investing in wetlands and things to deal with flooding, both from sea level rise and from weather events, which is striking places that were unforeseen from climate models just a few years ago. So there's going to need a lot of investment in infrastructure, and that infrastructure could look like plants. And so, how do we make those foresighted investments? When it comes to the future of work in cities and how we live, I mean, remote work, I think, is just the beginning. What the pandemic did of really breaking those norms about having to always be together, I think is going to lead to a lot of new types of organizations and new forms of collectives and people being together. I could go on and on about this, but we've seen, various ways of organizing people. Blockchain advocates talk about this with decentralized autonomous organizations. We're going to be able to simply pull collaborations together at various scales, in person, scattered across the world, with AI, with or without AIs. And that's going to need new spaces in which to work. Maybe it won't be our homes. I don't think it should. We can actually see studies that show that the most productive people are the ones who don't spend all their time at home or all their time in the office, but is going between the two. And so what does this new hybrid future of work look like? And where does that happen? And then finally, my biggest hope for cities is that, so we reinvigorate, we rediscover the joys of being around other people. That was my biggest hope coming out of the pandemic, is that once we were all locked inside for a year, we would want to be with people. And that's true. We see this, the reason that cities like New York have recovered where San Francisco haven't is because it's in the nightlife, it's in the dining. I was just in New York spending time sitting out in sidewalk cafes where people are enjoying this time together in this extended climate change summers. And so I'm hopeful for that. But yeah, the AI and other technologies sort of point to this vector where we spend increasing amounts of time alone indoors with our screens, and we're gonna actually have to push back on this one. There's real forces at work there when it comes to the way it tickles our brains here in terms of enjoying our phones and the technologies after that. So I could talk a bit about also like the real estate categories too, but I think that larger overall question is like, who do we want to spend our time with and why? Well, I think when it comes to the technology creating new connections while us feeling less connected is because, two things are at work, and this has been discussed a lot here when it comes particularly for the mental health of young people. we've taken away a lot of public space in the world. We've taken away places where people could be together, and particularly for young people, right? Forums and places where people used to get together, like shopping malls. The idea of, in North America that you would have teenagers who go to the mall. They're banned from going to malls. We've taken away these spaces and forced them into the phones and social media. So I think when it comes to making more connections, it's a two-step process. One, we're going to need technologies that are better at connecting us with the world around us to root us back into physical space, and then actually build more of those spaces. And this is why I've spent the last 2 years at Cornell Tech and elsewhere thinking about what the future of augmented reality will look like. And this is the world that we're emerging into now, not the Meta Quest and the Metaverse and the Apple Vision Pro, but some of these new technologies where wearing AI glasses, where you can ask AI, what am I looking at? What am I doing? Creating technologies that will actually root us back in the world and hopefully empower us to do things in the world, I think are going to be key to this. Because you're right, otherwise, we see this, for example, playing out in dating apps. And I bring this up because I think dating apps are a fascinating canary in the coal mine, where there's a collapse in interest in dating apps right now because people are tired of swiping, tired of that flattening. And you see in places like New York and elsewhere, running clubs and new forms of social organization where people are desperate to meet other people in real life. So how do we create these new kinds of rituals and being together in this? And I think this is true for cities. I think it's true for companies. I think it's true for anybody in organizations. How do we re-enchant our lives to be around other people? Because you're right, we're losing our ability to connect to each other, and we need to rediscover that. We need to train it like a muscle if we want to regain that function. Well, I'm always reminded to think about the best line from Harry Potter is about the Marauder's map, the magical map where you can see everybody on it. I believe Ron Weasley's father says, "Never trust a thing that can think for itself unless you know where it keeps its brain." And I feel like we've all spent the last, decade plus or so with social media and others never knowing where it keeps its brain. And so we've all been subject to some forms of digital manipulation. This is a project I've worked on for the US Secret Service about micro-targeting, about looking at forms after Cambridge Analytica, of course, which used Facebook to target potential voters in the elections of 2016, and also, of course, in Brexit. What happens when we're being preyed upon by algorithms and AIs that we don't really know what their ultimate intentions are? So I think that's part of the reason for the mental health crisis, is that we were treated by these platforms as a resource to be mined. And with AI, it takes it even further. We're all just training data for what they're trying to build. And so, I think when it comes to mental health, we need to push back on it, but push back on an individual level in terms of, what is it we really want out of these devices to actually explore what they're about. But again, thinking about also, again, policies as organizations, AIs are riddled with security flaws. If you're running a company, making sure that it's not preying on your employees, preying on your systems and data. And then if you're a government stakeholder, actually effectively regulating this. We've seen with the European Union's AI Act, the first meaningful stance on this. As we have this conversation, California is waiting to see if Governor Newsom will pass the first really substantive bill in the United States. We could be a moment where we think about this to protect ourselves, or, we sort of let it go because, of course, what's bad for our mental health is very good for the stock markets. Yeah, it's fascinating seeing the insurers on the front lines of climate change. And it was always going to be this way, right? They don't care about the ideology of it. They've got risk models and they see themselves going bankrupt unless they deal with this effectively. But you can see the way it's playing out here, where you see insurers are dropping as many policies as they can. I mean, being in the North American context, you see it in California, you see it in Florida, starting to affect Texas. They either want to drop tens of thousands of policies, abandoning those homeowners, or they're petitioning successfully to increase rates 20, 30, 40%. So you see people in places like Florida are unable to afford insurance on their homes. And what this means, and this is ultimately a bad thing on many levels, is that number one, people can no longer afford insurance. So they're either forced to move where they can, or they choose to simply risk it all and wait for the next disaster to hit. And so you're going to see places like coastal Florida, for example, you're going to have a place for the very rich on the water where they can decide to afford to, if they get hit, they'll just pay out of their own pocket to rebuild. Or you see it playing out in the US housing markets where, a lot of the housing availability over the last year is in the parts of Florida that were hit by Hurricane Ian in 2021. And so a lot of damaged housing. And this goes, you can see how this ripples through the system of permanent declines in value, which triggers financial prospects. I've been saying for years, as part of my work with Parag Khanna of Alpha Geo and others, that we risk having a Minsky moment like we did in the global financial crisis, where all this housing you thought was worth so much money is actually worth much less. And in a single instant, it's repriced with incredible calamitous effects. And the insurers are telling us, they're sending us signals right now that this housing is not worth what we once thought it was. And so, again, from a government policy standpoint, again, in the United States, we have the National Flood Insurance Program, which is going to go bankrupt. We need to think about how serious we are about, privatizing the profits and socializing the losses when it comes to climate disasters. And then longer term, we need to think about, where do we want to motivate people to go? And there's fascinating experiments I could talk about by, Zillow and Redfin and some of the various housing search, that if you show people the climate risk of these areas, they will make good decisions. They will choose to move to less risky areas. And how can we make incentives to move people to more climate safety and better climate regions? And that's true in Canada, Australia, and elsewhere, in Europe, obviously. But I mean, no place is safe, but some places are safer than others. And how do we create policies by choosing to invest in those safer areas that will guide people to them? And again, the United States context, we could talk about the IRA and some of the other policies the last few years to guide that investment. But we think, and by we, I mean Prague and others there, that the companies that choose to site themselves in the safest locations will actually turn out to be more profitable in the long run than others that aren't, because they're safer. Yes, well, it is interesting that, a moment here we were this close to decarbonizing the grid here. Along comes generative AI, and now, we're adding as much power as we possibly can. I thought the latest news I just saw is that, Microsoft has encouraged someone to rehab 3 Mile Island, site of the famous borderline nuclear disaster in 1979. So, all available sources of energy. I always like to say, that some say the world will end in fire, others say in ice, to quote, Robert Frost. And, until the advent of fracking and new technologies to get energy out, we were always worried about peak oil and peak energy. Now it's very apparent here that, we're going to keep chasing AI and other energy intense forms in pursuit of new technologies. So, I think to the credit of a lot of them, they're trying to get as much clean tech online. And there's a whole argument to be made that this will be the ultimate wind in the sails of the renewables energy industry, because just guaranteed demand for years to come. But it also means in the short run, reinvigorated interest in coal and in natural gas and in other forms of fossil fuels as well, too. So I do worry that we're going to blow right past 1.5C, the Paris Agreement, and emerge into uncharted territory. And it seems pretty apparent here that, the idea of sustainability, which, think about that word for a moment, what do you want to sustain? What are the values you want to sustain? And ultimately, sustainability is about business as usual continuing as it is. I definitely think that's not going to happen. We're not going to have business as usual. The technological vectors at play mean we're going to sort of go past that. And what is that going to merge into? I am ultimately hopeful here that we're going to see huge growth in renewables and that we can maintain some sort of, energy viability here. But I think we have to have a larger societal conversation about what values do we want to sustain? What is it that we want to preserve? And I think ultimately we should want to sustain our climate, not our economy. And that requires, I think, trade-offs, harder trade-offs than most people are willing to make, or at least policymakers are willing to make. As a final thought of this, I always come back to Amory Lovins, the great environmentalist and thinker of this, who back in the 1970s had this great line that, people don't want energy. They want hot showers and cold beer. And that's what we need to think about. What is it? What are the pathways to get there? You don't need the current grid. You don't need the current way of life. We need to choose what values we prize and then figure out the technological and policy paths that get us there. Well, my biggest concern about the Microsoft Blackroch tie-up, and they brought in other investors. I forget, it's an acronym, like the Global Investment Infrastructure, a very, very benign sounding. I don't think I have to question the biggest fear for me is not the sustainability piece of this. Bringing $30 billion of private equity and $100 billion in debt to basically build out clean energy infrastructure, clean-ish, nuclear and other renewables is fine with me. The larger question is that we are obviously, and Goldman Sachs and Sequoia and others have sounded the alarm on this, we are obviously in an infrastructure bubble. And in the very long term, that's good. The same way that, British railways of the 1840s or dark fiber of 20 years ago was good in terms of creating this latent capacity. I just worry about the fact that, there's going to be winners and losers in this. There's going to be a lot of losers when this bubble pops. And so what does that mean in the near term for, basically the fact that global stock markets now rely on NVIDIA and others? And so, and this plays out, of course, to many of the real estate clients I speak to as well, who are, infinitely interested in building data centers. You cannot go wrong at this particular moment building data centers. But who gets left holding the bag, and what does that look like? And how will the technological paradigms change? What if AI suddenly is much less data intensive or compute intensive? Hard to imagine, but we've seen in the history of computing that there's cycles of centralization, mainframes, the cloud, and decentralization, PCs on your desktop and phones in your pocket. What if that paradigm goes back and suddenly all those data centers trickle out into the world while all of our phones are doing computation for AI when we're not using them or other sort of latent capacity? So, I just hope that we're not throwing tons and tons of money after this, because it's that larger problem where we don't really know where the future is and we don't really know what to invest in. For the last 20 years, we've been chasing like any growth opportunity here because of low interest rates, et cetera. So, I just hope that we're not throwing good money after bad in this, and that, that we are in fact creating the infrastructure of the future, not just sort of a wasteful bubble like we were actually for a moment with crypto. Yes, I mean, I think we've barely begun to scratch the surface of what collaboration looks like post what? Post social networks, post anything. It's interesting. The phrase social network, of course, is much deeper than Facebook and social media. Social network is simply how people are related to each other and how they are connected. And this has been a passion of mine for more than a decade. We really don't know how people work together or who creates value in organizations. And most honestly, haven't been that interested in it. I mean, just the notion that we know, for example, that that org charts are not really reflective of how work gets done, that there are secret all-stars and superstars inside organizations, the glue that holds them together. We have the technology, we have the means to figure out who those people are. And we have the means to free ourselves from the myth that like whoever's in the office the longest is the most productive worker. I'm very disheartened, for example, by Amazon and others that are trying to now force a final return to office. We could invest in creating the technologies to understand, like basically how people are working together and how they're creating value and connecting to people outside of our organizations, and empower them to do that. And we're seeing this a little bit. I'm very heartened by the fact that there's a new role that's emerging inside organizations called Chief Experience Officer. This is finally that person I've been talking about for a decade who sits somewhere between human resources and facilities management overlooking the office. And their job is to simply help people work better wherever they are, however they are, in whatever medium. That's a role that needs to be incredibly empowered there. Just simply, if we really believe that people are your greatest resource, then simply enhancing them and creating the structures around them to help them do their job, whether that is a good home office and bandwidth, or whether that is creating space in the office or investing in third place office space for them, great. We should be doing all of the above. And so, so I would like to see that one, because I'm always fascinated by the fact that, that organizations typically learn that the most productive person in their organization is not the one who's in the office the longest, but then they forget it and they have to prove it all over again. I just hope we get to a point where we really intrinsically believe that. And, we see this. We see a number of organizations that are remote first or are hybrid first, but there's a lot that have a long way to go. And I'm looking at you, Amazon. Well, I don't know my biggest advice for corporations. I will say this. My thought on the technological paradigm emerging, where I'm most interested in, is that we've had, since the advent of the internet and the advent of the PC, is that digital technology happens on a screen that's in front of us. And that's been the interface to it. You use a mouse, you tap on a phone, you do these things, it's screens. What if the screen is over? What if we're moving past the screen? What if it's the Meta Ray-Bans on our faces? What if it is some sort of thing where we're able to see information in the world or interact through voice or other paradigms that go beyond a piece of glass that has information on it? And this is something that I've been thinking about at Cornell Tech, and thinking about, what happens when AI merges with augmented reality or merges with this kind of information, where it's now helping us make sense of the world and finding people and connecting with people. And again, this could be, potentially a bad thing if only a handful of companies control it, but it can be potentially amazing in the sense of a real Marauders map for the whole world, of guiding us to people and to things that we can find, of creating a world that's both more efficient in the sense of how a turn-by-turn directions for reality, but also more serendipitous in the sense it can guide us to things and people that we didn't know we should connect with. And so I'm very curious to see how that plays out. And they're all emerging experiments. For example, Dennis Crowley, who invented Foursquare, the app where you could check into places and see who was around you. He's got a new one where you basically listen on your earphones, your AirPods or your headphones, and it will tell you who's around you or point you in interesting places. There's all these new experiments here. And when it comes to organizations, this will play out in the form of retail, guiding you to things you didn't know you want to purchase, or helping you make purchases anywhere in the world. What does omnichannel commerce look like, where suddenly you can order anything from anywhere? Or again, transportation, mobility, e-commerce, logistics. I think there's so many potentials in that. So that's the technology that I'm keeping an eye on here. We talk about AI and we're trying to figure out the value in AI, but I think more it's about what happens when the screen is everywhere. And that, I think, is a true epic changer right there. What's next for me is hopefully speaking to LSP clients. That's what I'm always looking to do. I'm currently engaged in a number of research projects and applying for various fellowships with various groups. I'm really interested in working with some of the smartest people out there to think about what these futures of AI will be. I'm working with Arizona State and a collective of people around that to think about future threats to organizations, to governments, and elsewhere. Yeah, I'm one of those people, I believe in serendipity. So it's one of those things where I'm never working too hard on a single project, but waiting for collaborators and opportunities to come my way, and seeing where the currents of the future take me. So I'll let you know when I get there.